Welcome to Columbus Metro Club. Hope you guys are enjoying your lunch. I'm Amelia Robinson, the Opinion and Community Engagement Editor at the Columbus Dispatch, and I'm also a member of the CMC Board of Trustees. Welcome to the fifth program in our Democracy in Crisis series. We are so pleased you are here with us today. Before we begin, a few important things you CMC's partners throughout the Democracy in Crisis series has been WOSU Public Media. Our political series is sponsored by Hannah News Services. Today's forum partners is the League of Women Voters of Metropolitan Columbus. We also like to thank the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation and the Columbus Dispatch for presenting today's live stream. Let's thank all those supporting this forum today. The late U.S. Court Justice Louis Brandeis called states the laboratory of democracy. But thanks to gerrymandering and fiercely partisan politics, many Ohioans fear this laboratory is in jeopardy. Indeed, yesterday's election in Ohio once again featured unconstitutional district maps. Today, we'll look at the results of the midterm elections and what they mean for the future of democracy. Please welcome today's distinguished speakers. We have Karen Kasler, who is the Bureau Chief with State Ohio News Bureau. We have Bradley Smith, Professor of Law with Capital Law School, and former Chairman of the Federal Elections Commission. Dr. Wendy Smooth, who is Professor with the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at the Department of Political Science at Ohio State University. And our host is Mike Thompson, who is Chief Content Director of News and Public Affairs with WOSU Public Media. So let's give him a big applause. And you, of course, can learn more about our speakers and our moderator in your program. Mike, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, Amelia. You know, yesterday's election results showed us two things. One is the country is deeply purple, and Ohio is clearly red. We don't know all the results yet, but it looks like the U.S. House of Representatives will go to the Republicans, but just barely, just as the Democrats have held the House just barely for the past 2 years. The U.S. Senate is still kind of up in the air. It's either going to be 50-50 or 51-49 with either the Democrats or the Republicans in control. Ohio, not quite as dramatic. Republicans nearly ran the table. They won every statewide race from U.S. Senate to governor, all the way to Supreme Court. They held on to, even expanded their vast majorities in the Ohio Senate and in the Ohio House. The only bright spots for Democrats yesterday in Ohio was they won 2 congressional seats on either side of the state, way down in Cincinnati and way up in Northeast Ohio. 2 Democrats won those seats in relatively, perhaps mild upset. So my question for the panel, and I'll start with you, Karen. What is your biggest takeaway from this year's election?
I think that's really significant, that Ohio's congressional delegation shrunk by 1 from 16 to 15, and yet Democrats added to their delegation because there were 4 Democrats, now there are 5. Of course, these maps that these candidates were running on were ruled unconstitutionally gerrymandered. So the question then becomes, will they be changed significantly before 2024? Because the Republicans on the Ohio Redistricting Commission will have that opportunity to do that. But I think overall, while there were lots of polls that suggested that Tim Ryan would do well against J.D. Vance, and he did in a state that Donald Trump won in 2016 and 2020, anybody who thought that the results weren't going to be what they were has not been looking at Ohio's results over the last, well, really since 2010, but actually you could go back to 1994, the midterm elections then. That's when Republicans really started dominating these midterm elections when governors are elected, with the exception of 2006, because that was a Democratic wave year.
Bradley, your takeaway.
I tend to look at things a little bit more systematically rather than thinking about sort of the partisan results, which I think were, pretty surprising to most experts who are at least being honest this morning as we go across the country. What has struck me so far, and it's early, so things could change, but we haven't heard a whole lot of allegations from either party alleging various fraud and so on. There's Kari Lake, the Republican gubernatorial candidate in Arizona, has expressed some concern about that issue there, but I don't know that that's going to have any legs at all. And of course, if she wins her race, then those concerns will probably go away, and that's still up for grabs. But I think that's been, at least so far, a plus. And the other thing I think it simply shows, however, though, is that there's a dug-in partisanship. When you look at candidates who are as weak as Herschel Walker in Georgia or John Fetterman in Pennsylvania, and you just see that their voters for that party will not be moved off that candidate in any significant numbers. I don't think that would have been the case 20 or 30 years ago. I don't think those candidates would have been what I want to say, competitive. So to me, that continuing divide is a very, very important issue. But I'm at least pleased that so far the initial response has been relatively sanguine about accepting the results all around.
Wendy?
Sure. So definitively, Ohio is no longer purple. We can talk about ourselves in that way anymore, and it's going to be really interesting going forward when we think about Ohio's reputation of being able to predict or be the icon for presidential politics going forward. So we're going to be in the midst of a really big identity shift as a state. I think it's going to impact the traffic that we see through the state in the next presidential election, because we have definitively kind of defined who we are. One of the things that I'm really looking forward to in the next few days is to really dig down in terms of who has done, what turnout looks like across the electorate. I'm really curious about young people and turnout. We had a lot of interest in terms of whether young people would turn out nationally based on some of the issues, particularly young women, in terms of interest in the Dobbs decision. Also thinking about always the role of race in American politics in terms of where the ground game mattered, and particularly Georgia on my mind. I feel like I'm having a relapse of 2020, and I hear Ray Charles flowing in my head in terms of Georgia, Georgia, Georgia on my mind. I think we'll have that through Thanksgiving in terms of really determining what we'll know about the U.S. Senate. And I want to say again that shout out for following young voters and our students here from The Ohio State University. So glad to see you engaged in this conversation as well. We can't do enough to advance civil discourse among our young people, and so very glad to see our students here today. And I'm watching to see how young people 18 to 29 participated yesterday. And then one final thing I'll say is I feel like we've tempered down a little bit of the high stakes rhetoric coming out of last night. I think we're going to have different conversations about the nature and state of democracy, because I think the American people told us last night that they are ready to think about democracy as a sound investment, and I think that's part of what we saw last evening.
All right, let's start with the big race here in Ohio, and that was the race for U.S. Senate. It looks like J.D. Vance is going to win somewhere between 6 and 7%, 5, 6 or 7% over Tim Ryan. Wendy, let me start with you. Tim Ryan ran an aggressively unique campaign. He did not try to cater to the Democratic base. He went for the middle. He went for the white working class voter. He was the Trump Democrat, as he was called. Did it lead to his loss, or did it keep the margin within 10 points?
That's a great question. We're going to have to dig a little deeper. I've got to look at turnout in terms of what happened among the Democratic base. And particularly, I'm interested in our major urban areas and whether Tim Ryan's strategy was a strategy that would mobilize Black and Latino voters, and whether or not that's a strategy that the Democratic Party can continue to maintain and experience any success in doing so. So some of the rhetoric that we started to see out of the Ryan campaign, particularly in the latter days as it really ramped up, was really the kinds of messaging that certainly could appeal to more conservative Democrats, but when you look at the actual base of the party, those were demobilizing messages for many Democrats. And so I'd like to see what turnout actually looks like particularly in urban areas.
Karen, as I watched the results last night, J.D. Vance had, quote, taken the lead, gone ahead in the polls, but there were still a lot of votes left in Franklin County, Cuyahoga County, and Hamilton County, the big urban areas. But there wasn't enough for Tim Ryan to close that gap and overtake Vance again. The turnout just wasn't there.
Right, and I think there were a lot of people that might have been misled or confused or thinking other things when there were reports of long lines. And there were some places that were saying they were lines that they'd never seen before. But yet turnout was actually lower this time than it was in 2018 by about 289,000 votes once you add in all the provisional ballots. So I think that's a bit of a surprise, and I'm wondering why there would have been lines in some places if turnout was indeed lower. But I think Wendy's point about breaking that down and seeing how the different demographics turned out and the gender breakdowns and things like that are really going to be interesting to watch. So the other thing about that is you've got to, if you're a Democrat, turn out the big county votes. You've got to turn out Hamilton County, Franklin County, Cuyahoga County. You're probably going to win Athens County, as many Republicans refer to it, the People's Republic of Athens. What happened, you saw the results there. Nan Whaley won 3 counties in Ohio. She won Cuyahoga, she won Franklin, she won Athens. That's not enough. And the presidential candidates who've won Ohio, Barack Obama, for instance, have won 7 or 8 counties. And so that's the challenge I think Democrats have to do, not only try to reach out into rural areas and start winning back some of those votes, because rural Ohioans used to vote Democratic, but also to make sure that you're bringing in your voters in those big cities. And there's one thing that's just breaking now that's interesting. Democrats have, I guess, an interesting opportunity in that Republicans will have a new chair because Ohio Republican Party Chair Bob Paduchik has announced that he is leaving. And so that's an interesting note the day after his ticket basically swept into all the offices they wanted to win, and he is stepping down.
Interesting. Bradley, there was a lot of ticket splitting. I don't know exactly how many, but tens of thousands of voters voted for Mike DeWine and also Tim Ryan. It happened all around the state. What do you make of that? And does that lead credence to what Ryan's strategy was, that he wanted to get those ticket splitters?
Well, I think Ryan was about as good a candidate as the Democrats could have in Ohio. I don't think there's any reason to think that you could have done better with a different turnout strategy. Other than Sherrod Brown, who runs a campaign similar to Ryan, one of the Democrats won a state race. This year, the partisanship of Supreme Court nominees was on the ballot for the first time. The Republicans ran the table with 60%. I just don't think there's any reason to think that there was a better option for the Democrats than Ryan, or a better campaign strategy than what he ran. It's interesting, though, that Vance got about 53, 54%, it looks like. Portman won that seat with 57 and then 58%. Remember, it was an open seat when Portman first ran, obviously.
And he ran against a popular Democrat, named Democrat Ted Strickland.
And he ran in a strong Republican year initially in 2010. But this was, a situation in which the background conditions looked strong for Republicans. And in the end, it took a great deal of spending from the great villain of the Trump wing of the party, Mitch McConnell, to help Vance pull out of some midsummer doldrums. Now, maybe he would have anyway. We just could never be entirely sure of that. But all of that suggests to me, and when you look as well, not just at the Ohio governor's race, but you look at ticket splitting in places like New Hampshire or I'm trying to think, there are some other
Georgia,
examples.
there was a lot of ticket splitting.
Yeah, Georgia would be another. It suggests that candidate quality matters, and it matters a great deal. and that there is still a very strong, vibrant, we might call it traditional Republican sort of vote in a lot of these states.
And I wanted to add, with all of what Bradley just said, that Mike DeWine still ran almost 10 points ahead of J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance was at about 53%, Mike DeWine was at about 63%. So that's interesting. DeWine obviously had a coattails effect and brought along the 4 other executive office holders, the 3 Supreme Court justices, but he may not have been as much of a boost to J.D. Vance as maybe J.D. Vance was hoping for.
Wendy, the governor's race, as predicted, was not close. Nan Whaley, the first woman to run on a major party ticket for governor in Ohio, historic as that was, she just never gained traction. She never could raise the money she needed to get her message out there. Running against an incumbent governor is tough. An incumbent governor who's been in office for 40 years makes it even tougher. Is there anything she could have done differently to make the race closer?
You know, I think Nan Whaley did what Nan Whaley could do in a state like Ohio. I think her message was, she got stronger as the campaign season went forward. Her speaking style, the polish of her campaign was much better in the latter days than we saw early on. But it was really an uphill slug race. And I think Nan Whaley did what Nan Whaley could do, and given Nan Whaley's record and the nature of Dayton as a city, her politics just are far different than the lion's share of voters across the state, and that was clear from the results. Again, we are a red state, and we have to remember early in this campaign season, DeWine didn't look as strong as DeWine looked by midsummer, right? So there were some questions about DeWine early on, but the state rallied around the Republican candidate as Republican voters. And so the idea that Nan Whaley was going to be a very strong challenger, that we could have run any other candidate and had a different outcome for Ohio, is very unlikely.
Bradley, Mike DeWine took a lot of flack from members of his own party for his COVID rules early on, and he never fully embraced Donald Trump, but he never really shunned Donald Trump. He kind of ignored him. He showed up at a rally the day before the election, and he was on stage for exactly 50 seconds. So it says Mike DeWine's, it worked. He didn't anger the Trump folks so much that they didn't show up or perhaps even voted against him. And he still, the Republicans, as Wendy said, fell in line.
I think we saw that same dynamic in both Georgia and Florida. Florida being the other, in fact, the dominant, hugely bright spot for Republicans. DeSantis, remember, won that race 4 years ago by less than 0.5% after a recount. Last night he won by 20 points. That's an amazing shift of public opinion. And DeSantis ran by adopting a lot of Trump's substantive policies, by being aggressive and decisive, but by avoiding the sort of, personal insults, the direct attacks. He never suggested he didn't want anybody's vote. He tried to get those votes, and to a tremendous extent, he got them. And he ran by being very competent, his response to the hurricane, his COVID response policies. So there was just nothing there, either within his party or among independents to really complain about. It became a huge win. And I think to some extent, DeWine did a bit the same. Obviously, he angered a big part of the Republican Party, but it's important not to overplay the size of that part of the party. And I think we see that, by the way, on the Democratic side as well. There's so much now noise in social media and Twitter and Facebook and all these kinds of things that it becomes very easy, even for skilled professionals and candidates, to forget that those people are really a small part of the electorate. And they're also a part that drives a lot of the fundraising, which makes it some candidates eager to appeal to them. But again, in the end, money can't buy votes. It just gets a message out, and if you're given a message that nobody likes, you're not going to get there. So I think what we see is that the candidates need to remember Americans are not really radical. And having said earlier that I think you see that division, that hardening division, at the same time, I don't think most Americans think of themselves as hardcore left or hardcore right or anything, that they view themselves as a bit more in the middle with a lot going on. So to me, DeWine's victory, DeSantis's victory, people like John Sununu, again, running way ahead of his more aggressively Trumpish Senate candidate and his party, show that there is a big middle there that people can grab and do very well with.
The Ohio Supreme Court is now solidly in Republican hands. Karen, what happens now? Is redistricting reform dead? And that's the big case that's still out there. Technically, it's still being appealed, and the legislature is in not contempt, but they're not obeying the ruling.
Well, the balance of the court technically doesn't change in that the two associate justices were reelected, Pat Fisher and Pat DeWine, and then Sharon Kennedy beat Jennifer Bruner. They're both sitting justices, so Sharon Kennedy moves up to Chief Justice Maureen O'Connor's seat and becomes the chief, and then Jennifer Bruner stays on the court. Mike DeWine then appoints a replacement for Sharon Kennedy. So the balance is still 4-3. But the question then is, there's a big difference between how Sharon Kennedy and Maureen O'Connor viewed those maps. Maureen O'Connor sided with Democrats in ruling all 5 of the maps that were submitted for the Ohio House and Senate and both of the maps that were submitted for Congress as unconstitutionally gerrymandered. Sharon Kennedy, in all of those cases, was a dissent, voting to uphold those maps. So that certainly gives Republicans on the Ohio Redistricting Commission and state lawmakers the opening to go back to maps that they had used before or to try new maps that they want to see how those work. And I think the fact that 5 Democrats won 15 congressional districts, or won 5 of the 15, so they won 1/3 of Ohio's congressional districts, will probably suggest to Democrat or Republicans that they want to redraw at least the congressional map. So I think we're going to see this process go forward again because we have to. Those maps were illegal, but it's not going to be drawn out over more than a year like it was this time around.
Wendy, a large majority of Ohioans support fair districts, redistricting reform. A smaller majority, but still a majority of Ohioans support abortion rights, support Roe versus Wade. Those are the 2 big issues. Before the state Supreme Court, Republicans still ran the table. What does that say?
Says that partisanship is really quite strong in the state. I think these are 2 issues that we really do want to watch very critically. Early on, there was a lot of conversation about democracy being on the ballot. And it's really in the concrete notion of these redistricting cases where we really can make a strong argument for democracy being on the ballot. When we think about the principles of one man, one vote, and our districts being drawn to reflect that, versus our districts being drawn in large favor of one party over the other, that really is a core element of democracy out of alignment. These are cases that we as citizens need to pay very close attention to. We need to make sure that we're following the cases not only in Ohio, but across the country where we have some slight similarities, though not quite as egregious as we've seen in Ohio. So even for all of the rhetoric about democracy being on the ballot, this issue of redistricting is a really clear-cut, definitive space where democracy and the ability for people to elect service people of their choosing is really at the core of the conversation. And I encourage all of us to pay really close attention to what happens in those coming days when we're looking at that redistricting conversation.
Can I offer a bit of a different take on that? Yep. I think what really happens is this shows that there's just no end game there for people who think there's, quote, fair, non-political redistricting. Redistricting is an inherently political exercise. You have to decide which groups of people you're going to put together. Is it more important to keep all the citizens of Columbus together, or is it more important to keep the people on the north side of Columbus together with people on the near north side suburbs and people on the south side together with people on the near south side suburbs? Is it more important to keep Ohio River Valley communities together, or to slice them up in other ways? And what you see here is the courts can't make that decision, and there's nothing democratic about having the courts make that decision. Democracy has our country, right? Where's the term gerrymandering come from? It's not like a new term, right? This term goes back to the very beginning of the Republic. We have always had this, and I think to suggest that this is a major problem is just not necessarily true. For example, there are a lot of things that people don't even think about gerrymandering. If we're concerned about confidence in election results, for example, There's two things basically that really give people confidence in election results that we've been able to show. One, the second most popular is actually that people vote in person on election day. And I personally would like to see us get back to the idea that that should be the norm. We have exceptions, but that's the norm. But back to the gerrymandering question, the other thing is that your candidate won. And that's far and away the biggest. If your candidate won, you're pretty convinced the process was fair, right?
Let me ask you a question on gerrymandering, though. In Michigan, for years, Democrats have dominated statewide offices. But for at least 30 years, Republicans had supermajorities, let me finish, supermajorities in the legislature. Coincidentally, this year, Democrats have won the legislature in Michigan, coincidentally, after that state put an independent commission in place to draw the lines.
But let me finish, too.
Okay.
So what makes people confident is that their candidate won. Well, if you have gerrymandering, most of the people wake up the next morning and their candidate won. So if we're concerned
So if you're a Republican in
this,
Franklin County, your candidate did not win. If you're a Democrat
yes,
in
but,
the suburbs, your candidate did not win.
No.
All right.
Okay, let's go back. Okay. Gerrymandered districts are generally safe districts, right? So if you have a district that 60% favors one party, the next morning you wake up, you got 60% of the people are happy. If you have a big competitive district and it's 149.5 to 49.4, the next morning you wake up and only 49% of the people are happy. Now that's not saying it overrides everything else. But we add that to the fact that, again, most districts are going to be Republican or Democrat. You cannot get Republican districts out of Cuyahoga County. I don't care how hard you try. If you want competitive districts, you have to gerrymander. And if you look at the Michigan scenario, is it better for democracy to take Michigan now, which is a very closely divided state, and now it's going to have one-party government? Is that better, or is it better, in fact, that people see that there are kind of different checks? Our system of government is based on lots and lots of different checks, different electorates that for the Senate, different electorates for the House, different electorates for statewide office, right? And we have committees, and you're shaking your head. No, you're just not convinced. But I just ask you an open mind on this. You can't say that government is worse in states that are gerrymandered than in other states. And I don't think you're going to show that Michigan government is going to.
All right, I don't want to. Let's not have this about gerrymandering. Let's have it about the election analysis from yesterday.
Oh, it's so fun.
I know. We've had this. We have had this debate for a year and a half. We're going to have it for another year and a half. So let's move on to the election yesterday. Abortion as an issue. It was seen in the summertime as a mobilizing force for Democrats and those who support abortion rights. Wendy, was it a mobilizing force? Did it have an impact on this election?
So I think we have to look at a combination of conversations that were happening at the same time. So early on, Democrats were Dobbs all day long. Like we're going to talk abortion and we're going to talk about access to women's health. Over and over again, we had to hear as Ohioans the cringing story of the 10-year-old girl who could not access health care in the state of Ohio. Definitely a conversation that was mobilizing women voters across the country. However, if you look at what I think of as the October surprise, if there were an October surprise, was that Democrats in those days of October moved away from a conversation that was solely focused on women's health to really moving a conversation that was about the economy. And I think we have to look at those things in concert to understand how the Democrats were able to avoid a 2010, as Obama called it, the shellacking, which I can't get over that word enough. I use it every time I have an opportunity to talk about midterm elections because it was such an unlikely way to talk about a real incredible beatdown, to call it a shellacking. But in that particular 2010 election, Democrats lost over 60 seats in the House. That did not happen last night. And so that pivot away from an abortion-only conversation in late October, I think, was very meaningful for Democrats and, quite frankly, saved the shellacking that was anticipated. And, you know, the shellacking is just another way of saying holding off the red wave that we were so anticipating. And I think that shift to the economy, combined with the energy that we saw around a reflection on the Dobbs decision, is the explanation for why Democrats are still standing this morning and not kind of stooped over in a hunch and where do we go from here type approach this morning.
Karen, 4 other states had abortion on the ballot by itself. Michigan, Vermont, California all supported abortion rights in a referendum. Kentucky supported an abortion rights amendment on its ballot. And in Montana, it's close, but the abortion rights folks' side is winning in Montana. Our Ohio abortion rights supporters, looking at these states, particularly Kentucky, red state, voted pretty clearly for abortion rights. And how soon will we see that on our ballot?
Well, that and also what happened in Kansas this summer, I think there have been a lot of questions about when we might see a ballot issue like this. And ballot issues are expensive in Ohio. It takes a lot of time and a lot of money to put a ballot issue before voters. And the people who put that ballot issue together have to be fairly confident that they've got a winning strategy. Nan Whaley said yesterday that that's one thing that she would be looking at. Abortion and reproductive rights were a big part of her campaign. And so I could see her moving into that space and trying to put that before voters, say in 2024, to try to drive up Democratic turnout. But I think abortion was still behind the economy, like by half in almost every poll I saw. The polls that I saw had the economy and inflation leading, #1 issue, no question. Threats to democracy, which is differently interpreted depending on your point of view, I think. And then abortion rights were kind of right there in second place. And so I think Democrats trying to, as Wendy says, pivot to a conversation about the economy was speaking to that group of people who were still very concerned about gas prices and prices at the grocery store and everything. But I think abortion rights is definitely going to come back again. And what's happened in those states, especially the red states, is really interesting to watch.
Bradley, you mentioned that a lot of the election deniers did not fare so well yesterday. Donald Trump, should he announce for president next week or in the coming weeks, will still continue to harp on the 2020 election being stolen from him. Does yesterday's result affect his message, or does it sway whether he runs again, whether he has a chance of winning?
You know, I honestly have no idea. The former president's very mercurial, so whether it affects his message, I just don't know that I could say. It certainly creates a new dynamic. I mean, the sort of word on the street was he was looking forward to taking this big Republican victory, claiming tremendous credit for it, and zooming forward. Now he's got a much more complicated message, again, particularly in light of the fact that many of his endorsed candidates did not fare particularly well. Although, again, more mainstream Republicans like Joe O'Dea in Colorado also did not fare particularly well. There didn't seem to be a clear pattern to it. But nonetheless, it's going to be hard, I think, for the former president to claim that he's clearly the man, so to speak. And it would be interesting to see if he gets more criticism from other Republicans for his lack of support for many of the candidates that he proposed. For example, Mitch McConnell's PACs associated with Mitch McConnell spent more money just in Ohio helping J.D. Vance over the finish line than all of the PACs associated with Trump spent in all of the other races in the country. So it's, it will be interesting to see whether he draws some criticism for that as well as for the nature of the candidates. And then just add to that, of course, DeSantis is coming on so strong. That's a man who also has some difficult decisions to make as to whether his time is now or he should wait or how he should do this.
And Trump did say that if his candidates won, he should get all the credit, but if they lose, he should not be blamed for that.
Right.
So that's interesting. And he did make a comment yesterday about Ron DeSantis, suggesting that if DeSantis were to enter the presidential race, he had some dirt on DeSantis, and that maybe only DeSantis' wife knows because DeSantis' wife is really the one running his campaign. So this is really setting up to be a potentially ugly cycle for the Republicans when it comes to presidential candidates, because I think the idea that everybody would clear the way for Donald Trump may not be what actually happens, but it's still early. It's way early.
You know, it's going to be so interesting to watch how this plays out for voters watching Trump's response versus how party leaders will talk about Trump's response and who will say what publicly. So the gumption piece of who's going to actually speak up and make the claim or counterclaim against, because I'm pretty sure Donald Trump is going to take credit for whatever wins the Republican Party experienced on yesterday. But whether or not we'll actually see Republican Party leaders speaking in contrast to that. So where is the bravery to speak up and to actually call the record, right? And I am fascinated by DeSantis. I'm going to watch everything he's saying in the coming days, because already we've heard him say, well, you know, I did get that endorsement from Trump once upon a time, but what does that really mean about who I am as a candidate? And I'm my own man. And remember, we also have a Mike Pence out there in terms of what Mike Pence will say in terms of positioning himself. So this idea that, one, that Donald Trump won't take credit, I think we can dismiss that component. But then also, who is listening and who will have that kind of gumption to speak against the Trump voice in terms of what are the, as the young people would say in the room, where are the receipts for what you've delivered versus the rhetoric that surrounds what you're saying?
Here's Donald Trump's thing. He's going to say, I defeated Nancy Pelosi. I got the radical left out of control of Congress. And if they win the Senate, he said, I flipped the Senate. Which brings me to 2024 and Joe Biden. This is our last question, then we'll take questions from the audience. In Politico this morning, they quoted a Biden administration official saying, oh, Joe's definitely running after yesterday's performance. The bottom line is they still likely will lose the House, the Democrats will, and the Senate is very much up for grabs, and they could lose that. It's still a win. It's an overtime 1-point win, but it's a win for Republicans yesterday. Should Joe Biden run in 2024?
Oh, I think Joe Biden's running in 2024.
Should he run in 2024?
Well, now, there are all sorts of ways we could think about the should and the shouldn't. I mean, with Biden and Trump, I mean, there's some real questions that we have to raise in terms of should either candidate move forward. But I think clearly Biden sees this as a tremendous win. He sees this as the icing on the cake. It's not the type of loss that was anticipated. Republican strategists are already having to think about what does governance look like with a small majority versus the kinds of strategies that were early on discussed around the real polarizing type approaches to governance that we were talking through earlier this summer. And so Biden is going to run again, and governance of a small majority in the House will look very different for Republicans. And so it's going to be a lot to watch. A lot to watch.
All right, it is CMC's tradition to take questions from our audience. We have questions coming in online. And if you have a question here in the room, please go to the microphone there and line up, and we'll get to as many as we can. If you do ask a question here, please keep your questions brief, short, to the point, and no political stump speeches, please. Jane.
I have some questions, and if you have a question, we'll go every other one. So, Dee Dee Geis from Mother's Law Center. What is responsible for the Ohio Democratic Party losses? A, lack of support from the National Democratic Party. B, failure to turn out voters. C, gerrymandering. Or D, something else.
Or, Bradley, all of the above.
All of the above. That's my answer, all of the above.
What do you think, Bradley? What do you think? What can the Democratic Party do? It's been a tough few cycles, with the exception of 2006, which, frankly, was because of a scandal, the Tom Noe CoinGate scandal. They won then, but they haven't won since. Or before.
I'm not a Democrat. I'm not the one to answer that. I think the answer to the immediate question is all of the above, and what can they do? I'm not really sure. I think the demographics of Ohio right now are turning the state gradually away from them, and I don't think we're going to become a one-party state like, Idaho or Massachusetts, but I think that it's going to continue to look as a state where the Republicans are dominant for some time to come.
Karen, it's early. What is the hand-wringing on the Democratic side looking like right now?
Well,
Has their party chair announced his or her resignation?
Well, now that the Republican Party, and there are some issues in the Republican Party. I mean, Bob Paduchik was he was being challenged by his vice chair. There were some lawsuits over money. There were some things going on in the Republican Party. Even though they were having these big wins, there were still some issues behind the scenes, so to speak. But Democrats have had a lot of issues too in terms of fundraising. I mean, they were way far behind. Nan Whaley just could not keep up with Mike DeWine when it came to money. And this is, I think, reflective of Democrats having not had big wins for many, many cycles. And it's hard to field a team of great candidates and raise money to support them when you keep losing. And so that's going to be the challenge that Democrats have to do, is to figure out, how do you rebuild again? It's kind of like the Cleveland Browns. You keep having to rebuild. I say this as a Browns fan, just for the record. But I mean, you keep having to rebuild and hope that this is the formula that's going to bring you forward, and it may not be.
Sure. And I just pull in one additional thing. So you look at the party infrastructure in Ohio versus a party infrastructure in a place like Georgia, which looked like a very unlikely place for the Democratic Party. But those kind of close wins, that high energy close wins, and of course the 2020 race, that has built a different type of infrastructure in Georgia than we see in Ohio for Democrats. So the bench is more rich in those places where you've had some close wins. The energy is higher, the donations are higher, the national attention is higher. It's a much different uphill battle for Democrats in Ohio in terms of building back the infrastructure of the party, and to be able to get national money into Ohio races. There's just not a lot of incentive to invest in a state that has become as red as Ohio has become, and again, redistricting.
I'm on the program committee. You all and everybody else I've heard on TV talks about how this was such a surprise many places. We're just going to put Ohio aside for a minute. Every place else. I tend to think that history can only inform the present and the future if the data points are the same. And it seems to me that a lot of the data points are different with this election. I think Wendy talking about she wants to look into voters of color turnout. She wants to look into younger voters. But I understand that your job is to take what you've learned from the past and apply it to now. But what are some other data points that you think are different from what has been in the past? Because I'd like to not think that we're just stuck where we are.
Good question.
Well, I
You've
think
stumped the panel.
I'll go ahead and say one thing. One thing that I think is particularly interesting is that for a party to run as far ahead of its incumbent president's job approval ratings in a midterm is almost unheard of. I don't know how far back one would have to go to find that, but you have to go farther back than I've tried to go back, which is well into the 70s. If a president is sitting there polling at a 42, 43% approval rating, and he's got a midterm for his party to exceed maybe 45, 46% of the vote in the congressional races is really an amazing factor. I don't know quite what caused that, though, and so I don't know quite what the answer, what that means for us going forward. I really don't. We may find out more. We need to get more exit polling data, like if you look at the impact of Dobbs. I'm pretty convinced it had an impact. I'm not sure how big an impact it had. I think we need to start really getting the exit polling data out that allows people to delve into that.
Since election integrity didn't seem to really be a big topic yesterday or today in the news, do you think that maybe we're beyond that and we're not going to have so much allegations of fraud moving forward?
An optimist. Karen, what do you think?
It's early. I think Bradley mentioned it that, Carrie Lake in Arizona, if she loses, it seems likely that the claims again that the false claims again that Arizona has a rigged election are going to come back out. If she wins, magically.
For those who aren't aware, there were 60 voting places in the Phoenix area that had trouble with their machines, and they had to do paper ballots, and it was kind of a mess for a little while yesterday morning.
But I think that there is some optimism in looking at some of the results, that some of the biggest, most vocal election deniers, Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania, and I'm trying to think of some other ones off the top, Tudor Dixon in Michigan, they lost. And I think that there's something for that. I think as this all shakes out, we'll be able to look and see who did win, and also how the ones who did win, if they're going to moderate their message at all. I mean, J.D. Vance has kind of been on that election denier train there, but getting off every now and then and jumping back on. So I'd like to hear what his message is now, and if he is still strongly, and he's never really been strongly in the camp that the 2020 election was stolen. I mean, he's raised questions, but that right there, every time you raise questions, it's problematic. And it's really been problematic on election workers who have been threatened and who are leaving those jobs in droves. These are professional people who we depend upon for elections, and they're members of the community, and they're getting threatened by other people in their community. It's appalling.
There's a real quick point I want to make that may not have been clear either from my opening comments, which are there's two parts of this narrative that I think are in trouble, because the other part that simply collapsed is the voter suppression narrative. That just collapsed yesterday, the idea that there's this massive vote suppression going on across the United States. So my hope is that on both sides, and for years I've been giving a speech called Much Ado About Nothing, suggesting that we've got two narratives, one of voter fraud, one of voter suppression, neither of which has almost any connection to reality. And my hope is that maybe we'll get past both of those, and that will enable us to then start moderating rhetoric in other areas, which I think would be good.
Wendy, you want to weigh in on that?
Absolutely. So the voter suppression conversation is one that I think we're going to see on an ongoing basis. You can't just wipe away and say voter suppression hasn't occurred until we actually see the cases that come forth post the election cycle. Voter suppression has happened in a number of different areas. When we look at Pennsylvania, for example, the purging of some of the ballots there, you know, we can think about what consequence that had for the election, but when you think about the consequences for democracy and the ways in which people have either faith or very limited faith in the nature of voting and the importance of voting, voter suppression is an incredibly important issue that we always have to pay attention to. Back to that history question, voter suppression is a part of our USA DNA, and we've got to accept that in terms of understanding how our elections have historically functioned. And we have to understand that in terms of the ways in which we understand what happens in a contemporary context, whether we're thinking about it in wide-scale approach or whether it happens in very succinct localities. If voters are suppressed, that's a challenge for democracy and something that we should care about as caretakers of our democracy.
Sir.
I'm John Lowe. January the 6th, I'm wondering, seemed to have a mixed influence on this election. I'm wondering what you think about it, how much influence and who it influenced. And going forward, is that going to continue to be an issue, or are we just going to kind of set it aside?
Karen, it didn't work out for J.R. Majewski.
Well, there were some other things that didn't work out for J.R. Majewski.
He was the congressional candidate in the Toledo area, Republican.
It worked out that he painted a picture of Donald Trump on his front lawn. That got him noticed by Trump, and Trump endorsed him. He ended up winning the primary and beating a couple of seasoned politicians for that opportunity to go against Marcy Kaptur, but then he misrepresented his military record. And
he was at January 6th.
And yes, that's true. And Republicans then pulled out their support that allowed Kaptur to really take back that area. I think that district was tipping toward Democrats anyway. But yeah, I mean, that's why I said earlier the whole idea of threats to democracy, depending on your point of view, for Democratic candidates, threats to democracy, January 6th, claims of the stolen election, all that stuff. For some Republican candidates, this idea of voter fraud. And there was some voter suppression out there in Arizona where you had armed people sitting outside ballot drop boxes. I mean, that's gotta freak some people out. And so I think that there's the Department of Justice was even looking into some of that. So I'm interested to see what Bradley was saying about voter suppression not being an issue. In certain cases like that, how can you argue it's not?
Well, I'm thinking about the idea that there's this massive legal, bills like Georgia's law, which the president denounced ridiculously as Jim Crow 2.0 and Jim Eagle, and all that stuff gone. These laws are not suppressive laws. But the other thing is that it's important to note that you could threaten democracy in a lot of ways. In the last year, I've seen 5 different national polling companies do a poll in which they've asked a question in some version of which party is a greater threat to democracy. In all 5 of those polls, right, a plurality of voters said the Democratic Party was a greater threat to democracy. Now, why is that? There could be any number of reasons, and I just ask people to think about them. Is it the fact that you have people seriously talking about packing the Supreme Court for nothing other than they clearly don't like the results they're getting? Is it doing away with a 150-year-old tradition like the filibuster for nothing than immediate short-term gain? Is it people seriously talking about adding new states to try to change the makeup of the Senate? Is it Senator Chris Murphy, Democrat of Connecticut, and the White House both suggesting that now that Musk has taken over this Twitter, we may need a national security investigation into Twitter? These are all kinds of things that might make a lot of people think, whoa, I think those guys are a bigger threat to democracy than a few crazies going at the Capitol on January 6th who don't really seem to represent what most of the people in the party thought.
A few? A few? Really?
In a nation of 400 million, yeah, I think you can say it's a few. And they were not people in high-powered positions. They were not people in high-powered positions like the people who are arguing that we need to, add new states, pack the court, things like that, get rid of the filibuster. Every Democrat in the Senate about a decade ago voted to amend the First Amendment to make it easier to limit speech by their political opponents. Every single one voted for that. And that was what they intended to do. So there are lots of reasons why people are going to look at this. And what I would say to all of you who are snickering and stuff out here is you need to face the reality that the polls keep saying that. And you need to ask, okay, so maybe Smith's crazy, but why is it that a plurality of Americans...
Do you have the numbers on that poll? You said plurality. Was it 32% or was it 45%?
They vary. Most of them are very close. There was one Rasmussen poll in which was a double-digit margin. The other pollsters were, if I remember right, Sienna Maris, Quinnipiac, and I can't remember. I think it was Fox was the 5th.
But you have 32%, 31%, and then the rest undecided.
You have a different, most of them it's about 40%, and again, it's very narrow. None of that really matters, the specific numbers, because the key point is, what I can tell them, I can read the room at least a little bit, and you're all sitting there going, oh, this guy is crazy. And my response is, well, look, let's suppose that all of those had a narrow plurality saying that the Republicans are a greater threat. You've still got a huge percentage of the public that is sitting out there looking at the Democratic Party and say, they are a greater threat to our democracy than Republicans are. And you need to ask yourself why that is. Could it be that Democrats spent $50 million, over $50 million, supporting MAGA Republicans in the primaries? If they really thought that these guys were a threat, is that what they would have been doing? So you add all these kinds of things together.
Let's let Wendy chime in, then we're going to get some more
questions.
Go ahead, Wendy.
So I'd love to see the breakdown of the data. That's all I'd like to, say. And also thinking about who's represented in that polling in terms of who's going to point fingers at whom. One of the things that I want us to pay very close attention to as wonderfully engaged democratic citizens, when we have these questions about rhetoric in our electoral discussions, when we think about the kinds of legislation that have passed across the country and we want to rule whether or not they are overtly about voter suppression, I want us to look at who's been able to show up before that piece of legislation passed and who's able to show up after. I want us to look at when we have overt actions like the arrest that we saw in Florida, and we want to think about the chilling effect on democratic participation. Those of us who care about democracy, small d, we should care about any moment in time in which voters are not able to exercise their voices at the ballot box, no matter what form that takes, from changes in laws to thinking about other kinds of election suppression tactics like arresting people of color prior to an election for election fraud and the chilling effects that can have on people's participation. We all need to care about these things, whether you're Democrats or Republicans, because this is about small d.
All right, one more question, please. All we have time for. Go ahead.
So this is our flash round. Richard Needles says there's a clear voting divide between the big cities in Ohio and the smaller towns, rural communities. How can these two better understand and relate to each other? And I think we've demonstrated some differences on our panel.
Karen, that divide is there, and it's
Oh, it's been there for a long time. And you see it in budget cycles, you see it in all sorts of areas at the Statehouse, where, by the way, the Statehouse, Republicans have a supermajority and actually strengthened it in both the House and the Senate. So that's, I don't know if that's going to be resolved, the rural versus urban debate. I think that's a continuing question.
Bradley, real quickly, what's your solution to the rural-urban divide?
Well, I think the biggest solution is probably to have government essentially do fewer things so these issues don't quite matter as much. I think that's one of the reasons our politics becomes increasingly bitter, is because more and more everybody feels like they're in a zero-sum game rather than you're out there participating in the market and living your lives, and you can live it one way in one rural county and another way in an urban county, and you don't have to worry about the legislature imposing one set of values or budgetary priorities on you.
All right, Wendy?
I think there's some really clear issues that we can talk across the urban-rural divide, education being one. If we think about some of the challenges around education, rural and urban communities have some similar concerns. We just need to figure out better ways to talk about it, and hopefully we can get to some of that if we tamper down some other kinds of rhetoric.
Well, this is our Democracy in Crisis series, and I do think that, discussions like this, frank discussions but civil discussions, will help our democracy, and I hope you will continue to attend these forums. We have a few more on the way, but thank you all. Go ahead. Emil.
Well, I certainly hope that you learned something today or heard something that renews your love and appreciation for democracy, because we're certainly, lucky to have our democracy, so let's protect it. We definitely wish we had more time to talk to this wonderful panel, but we do not. I want to thank you to CNC's partners for the Democracy in Crisis series, WOSU Public Media. Thank you to our political series sponsor, Hannah Media News Service, and to today's forum partners, the League of Women Voters of Metropolitan Columbus. Thank you to our online virtual seat patrons, and to the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation and the Columbus Dispatch for supporting this live stream. Please make plans to join us next Wednesday as we host the new leaders of the Columbus Dispatch, Edwina Blackwell Clark, and yours truly, me, Amelia Robinson. We're going to have a great conversation about the future of journalism in our community. I want to thank today's speakers. I don't want to spank today's speakers. That's weird. Maybe you, Mike, but not the rest of you. Karen Kasler, Bradley Smith, Dr. Winley Smooth, and Mike, our host, Mike Thompson from WSOU Radio. Okay. And thank you all for joining us. Have a great day.